Greetings, everybody. One more time. Great to see you, everybody. My apologies for that. So as I was saying, before I rudely interrupted myself, we take great pride at the ISRM on creating a platform, offering a platform where significant thought leaders from academia, policymaking, and the practitioner environment can come together and have a grown-up conversation about some of the issues that we as a global community are facing in the world. And I'm delighted to say that we have maintained and perhaps exceeded that tradition today. We have, I'm delighted to say, 4 panelists from around the world who are each in themselves are leaders of significant global organizations. And I believe have lessons for us all, and that is not confined to the female portion of the audience. So I'm very much looking forward to today. And having been brought up now in a house with a mother, a wife of 27 years and 2 daughters, I will shut up. And I will hand it over to Emily. And Emily, I'm delighted to say that you are with the Crisis Response Journal co-hosting this. It is a pleasure to have that. Crisis Response Journal, myself and Jenny and Amy are all on the editorial advisory board, which I think we're all very happy to do so. But Emily, I'm delighted to welcome all of you on behalf of the ISRM to this event. And Emily, I will now hand over to you.
Thank you very much, David. I'm absolutely delighted to be taking
Emily,
part. I am.
Oh no, sorry, my mistake. Keep going.
You get me. Oh, Zoom. Yeah, I'm absolutely delighted to be taking part, but I'm also slightly uncomfortable because I think I've got a bad case of imposter syndrome here, given the amazing 3 other participants we've got. Also, I like to lurk in the shadows a little bit more, doing my own thing. And like many women, talking about myself in a public forum isn't really my forte. But I think this discussion's actually really interesting because all panelists today started out in what were male-dominated environments, and things have changed. And I'm the same. I started working for a publication in the fire and rescue services field, where I worked for 17 years in the days when it was almost exclusively male. However, I was lucky that my editor was a female, and she was very protective of me, sometimes overprotective, as it were. And frankly, being female in this both opened and closed doors and minds to me, but I was too oblivious of the latter. And I only realized weeks, if not years later. So in some cases, my ignorance worked very well. If you don't see slights or sexism or difficulties, you don't react to them, and you just get on doing with the best job you can without seeing obstacles. And just one other point, it was very interesting because Crisis Response Journal actually came about because I struggled going back to work after the birth of my daughter. It wasn't the industry, it wasn't the fire and rescue services but it was the way the office environment had changed. And it had changed to a very laddish, let's all go out and play pool at lunchtimes, meet up after work and get drunk. And there was some really awful banter going on around about secretaries and other female workers and so on. And that wasn't the primary reason for me leaving, but it was contributory. And in my maternity leave, I'd changed and the office environment had changed. So I left and set up CRJ just before my daughter's 3rd birthday. And raising a child and launching a business is hard. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. But I did have massive support from family and friends. You do get the guilt. And I think that's something that that is more exclusively on the female side working in this sort of environment. But equally, I think today my daughter actually understands and appreciates what I was doing. Crisis Response Journal is run by a female team, and that's not through design. It's just happened the way it's happened. And we always try to give voice to women, but that does mean that that does not mean we discriminate positively. But maybe we're more open to listening, and I think that's a female trait in leadership. Listen, then decide, rather than decide and plow on. And in my view, all I can say is it should be that your gender doesn't raise an eyebrow in whatever role you are. It's just a natural. If you're the best person for the job or you're doing the job, then it shouldn't matter. I think in some cases it still does, but I think that's all I've got to say to introduce. I'm really looking forward to the discussions.
Thank you, Emily. What I should have done is I should have introduced our other panelists. It is a pleasure to welcome Dr. Jenny Hesterman, who had a full career in the US Air Force, ending up as full colonel, and is now involved in defense and security agencies, both as a mentor, as a leader, as a teacher. We have Amy Pope, who served in the Obama administration as, I believe, Deputy Secretary for Home Affairs, for Homeland Security, with personal responsibility for a number of significant issues, and is at the moment a partner with Schillermans in an executive corporate legal company in London, and is also an associate fellow at Chatham House, which of all of those things impresses me more than everything else, Amy. That is a significant recognition. And we have Pascale Meige, who is director in the International Federation of the Red Cross, Red Crescent Society, and with responsibility for crisis, disaster, and climate change. That must keep you busy. I mean, one of those would be enough for most people, but all three, oh my God. Can I start off by asking you, please, just go around the table and just introduce yourselves. And I will, as we discussed yesterday, I'm happy to start off in the order on my screen. So Jenny, can we ask you to just introduce yourself? So maybe just take a few minutes to give us an understanding of what your worldview of some of the subjects we're looking at might be.
Absolutely, thank you. Thanks for everybody who attended today. I'm in the United States. I'm in Charleston, South Carolina, which is on the East Coast. I can see the ocean from my room here. So good morning and good afternoon to those in a different time zone. I am retired Air Force. I came into the Air Force in 1986, and I was 20 years old, 20-year-old college graduate. So young, fresh, naive, excited to tackle all the challenges in the military. And of course, there were very few women in 1986 in the military. And I went into the combat area. I was actually in the fighter aircraft area. I was a war planner. I was the first female war planner. I kept volunteering for more jobs, more unique jobs. And what I found in the military is the system is there. It's very strong to grow leaders. It's very rigid and structured. And so if you do your job and you do what they tell you to do, you can make your way through the military and have a fantastic career. So kind of got off to a unique start for a woman in the military. A lot of lessons learned along the way. All of my mentors were men because the layer of women above me, many of them were either not married, which I was married. My husband and I were both on a fast track. They never had children, which I wanted to be a mom, which I did have our daughter when I was a lieutenant colonel. I was a commander. And I was 33, and that was another unique thing, was to be a commander, be pregnant. It was very interesting. So there were a lot of challenges along the way, but a couple takeaways from my career is just having male mentors. They were fantastic. Now I love to mentor female officers because I didn't have that. I didn't have anybody who looked like me, who wanted to be a mom and have a military career. So I really reached out to them. Another thing was just balance, trying to find balance. I think as women, we struggle with balance. We're by nature, we're caretakers. So we make sure everybody else is taken care of, and then our own, even just medical appointments, exercise, things like that. So I had to really struggle to find that balance and achieve it, so I could bring my whole person to work every day. After I retired, I did go into the counterterrorism world as a private contractor. Again, a very male-oriented career field. But I think, there's so much opportunity now. It's been such exciting times to watch women go from, where they were in the military in 1986 to now being Thunderbird pilots and fighter pilots and combat pilots. I feel like we've really broken the glass ceiling in the military. Obviously there's still room to go. We still don't have females in leadership positions like we should. So, still the challenges continue. But I think those are the key takeaways for me from my career, is just the power of a male mentor, how women can mentor men, how men mentor women, the struggle for a balance, how to achieve balance, and why it's so important. But I think, this next generation coming into the workplace is different than we were as well. So we need to really keep an eye on what they want and what they need. But that's a little bit about me, and I'm just really happy to be here today. Thank you.
Let's maintain professionalism. I think you used a phrase which I imagine that pretty well all of you will use at some stage, which is "I was the first." And I imagine that for many of you, you were the jungle explorers. You were going where no one had been before, and of course you've now created that pathway. Of course, each generation has to do that for themselves. But I imagine that all of you have been absolute pace setters in ways that probably would have been inconceivable to previous generations. Amy, let's come to you. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Absolutely. Thank you so much, David, for hosting me, and Emily for reaching out and including me in the advisory board of your journal. It's been really, really important and to have these conversations. So my name is Amy Pope, and I am a fairly recent transplant to the UK. I moved here in 2017 after President Obama, his administration ended. And I found myself looking for a job in the private sector for the first time ever in my career. I was very lucky to end up at Schillings, which is a law firm, but we also do crisis response more broadly. We have a cyber team, we have a investigations team, we have political risk advisors. And so I'm taking a lot of the practices from my White House role into the private sector, and that's been a lot of fun. So I think the key, there are a number of key lessons for me. One is that I started my career as a prosecutor in the Justice Department, and that is a notoriously male field. It is changing, but the tactics I used as a 22-year-old or young attorney or paralegal in the field, which was largely to make the older white prosecutors think that my ideas were theirs, are no longer the same tactics that I often need to deploy today. From the Justice Department, I spent time working in the Senate as counsel and then eventually onto the White House. And at the White House, I have to say, I was tremendously lucky because President Obama made a conscious decision that he wanted to create a National Security Council that was more reflective of America. And for the first time ever, really, the National Security Council leadership was all women. Susan Rice led the National Security Council as his NSA, his National Security Advisor. Avril Haines was the deputy to Susan. Lisa Monaco was the President's Counterterrorism and Homeland Security Advisor. And I was Lisa's deputy. And our chief of staff was a woman as well. Some were moms, some were not. But having that group of women really lead the president's foreign policy and national security policymaking was a tremendous experience for me. And it's not to say that it didn't, the policy issues were handled in very significantly different ways, or we arrived at very significantly different conclusions, but there was a real focus on making sure that people had the opportunity to speak, to hear different points of view, to consider points of view. One of the tactics, and this has been written about publicly, so I'm not giving away any secrets, but one of the tactics the women in the White House used was to reiterate what other women around the table had said. There had been this unfortunate tendency for, and I'm sure we've all experienced this at some point, where a woman will make a point, and then a few minutes later, a man will make exactly the same point, as if she never said it. And recognizing that, the women in the White House made a deliberate effort to say things like, well, as Avril just said, or I want to build on Lisa's excellent point, just finding ways to validate each other's voices and points of view in a very deliberate way to make sure the voices were heard and the issues were really brought to light. The other thing I found that was useful, the National Security Council is a tough place to work because much of the work is classified. You have to be on call. You have to respond at a moment's notice. But there are times when you can sneak out, and there are times where you can take a break, and there are times where you can shift the work. But there wasn't a lot of talk about that when I first arrived at the National Security Council. And one of the things that I did that was really, frankly, selfish, but it ended up creating a community that helped a lot of others, was to start an NSC moms group where we would meet once a month and we'd get around a conference table and we'd share our frustrations and our tactics for coping, share ways to support each other, and then bring in people like Susan Rice or Valerie Jarrett or the president's other senior advisors who'd gone through similar experiences to share their views. And one of the things that was really terrific that came out of that experience was that Susan asked us to put together some policies that we could deploy within the National Security Council that would help it to be a more family friendly, that's a bit of a stretch, but at least family aware place. And she took that seriously, and we put together those policies and we gave them to her, and she implemented them. And it was things like that, creating the community of support, having leadership who recognized that it was important to have women at the table, looking for opportunities to mentor up and down, that I think made it such a wonderful experience for me, and lessons from which I continue to draw upon.
Thank you, Amy. It's very interesting because you talk about sort of that moms group. Men go to the club. I mean, they have that, you know, and that's where they do their networking and their support. And it's so often, you know, and I think it's changed, but it's probably still there, maybe slightly more unconsciously. It's just these built-in biases that we have. You know, these just assumptions about this is the way things are done. And it's interesting to hear about sort of how you specifically were highlighting specific points. And, you know, just, it's not good to do psychops on your own people, let's face it, okay. But nevertheless, you can sort of use certain ways that you can influence, you know, you can influence the conversation, influence the dialogue, the feeling in the room. Thank you for that. Thank you for that. So we've had the military, we've had the government. Let me just bring this onto here now. So we've had the military, we've had government. So now we go NGO. Now we go to the third sector, if you want, which is the International Federation of the Red Cross and Red Crescent Society, which is a global organization, like all of the organizations, but global, strategic, complex, and mission critical in many, many, many ways. Failure is not an option, and failure has consequences. So Pascale, it is an absolute delight to have you. We tried to get you on our previous one. Unfortunately, diary didn't allow it, but it is lovely to have you here. Welcome, and would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, thank you, David. Indeed, it's been quite busy for all of us this year somehow for many reasons, and it is also busy at the moment with everything that is happening in terms of climate change and weather-related events, unfortunately. But I have beautiful mountains in my view. Maybe Jenny, you have the ocean. I have mountains, which is a privilege as I'm based in Switzerland. Maybe just to say, like Emily, I'm not very comfortable about sharing my private feelings in public, and often we do discuss gender issues with female colleagues, but not necessarily in such a setup. But I find this very important indeed, because every time we had those exchanges between ourselves as smaller groups, I mean, Amy, you were talking about moms groups, but it can be just these, you know, women groups that you create in your work environment, and this has been extremely useful and extremely empowering. So I think making it available for a wider public is a responsibility in some ways for us. Maybe just to say also from very early on in childhood, I claim my female identity, because my name in French is Pascale, and actually it has an E at the end, which doesn't show on my screen at the moment for some reason. And I kept being treated as a boy because it's more common to call a boy Pascale. And I was always so angry that people would not recognize me for what I was. I was a girl, and there was no reason why I should be by default treated as a boy. So I think it connects to very early on this feeling that I had to fight for being respected as a woman and not being seen for something else. So just to say, stay authentic, never try to hide behind a man, whether it is with your name or whether it is with your style and your attitude. This is something that I have noticed for myself. In the conversation that we had to prepare for this for today, you were asking David about you know, what are the challenges that we faced, and mentors and role models. And reflecting on this, I was actually realizing that I rather identified all along what I could not identify with, because same as Jenny, I did not have the ideal role models. We didn't have humanitarian managers, leaders, senior executives that were not only women, but women with children. And I knew I wanted to have a life as a woman also with a family. So I was rather looking at all these things that I did not want to become and what I did not want to do. And at some point I almost felt management is not for me and leadership is not for me, because the representation of it is just so not me and not what I want to become. I have this example that is still in my head, that we had a management training in the Red Cross that I was following, and when we were talking about, you know, what these managers, heads of delegations, we call them, you know, those country representatives. I was working with the International Committee of the Red Cross at the time in conflict environments, which I did for 11 years in the field and 22 years in total with dealing with those contexts. And at some point we were talking about collaboration and, you know, bringing the voices of people and making sure that we were creating the ownership of the teams. And then someone said, yeah, but you still need at some point, you know, to take a decision and put the fist on the table and knock the table. And I was looking at this and thinking, wow, if that is really what is required to be respected as a head of delegation, I don't want to become a head of delegation. That's not my way. And having all these conversations about what is actually something you don't want to be, and then what are you proposing instead, and trying to theorize and explain rather than just being it, I think is very important. So actually, I did carry the role of being gender equality advisor within the International Committee of the Red Cross for 3 years, coming from my practice and having, you know, done the sort of climbing the ladder. And this was for me so useful because I could put a theory on just about everything, and then taking a step back and looking at it from above. You know, you look down at yourself and say, okay, I'm in that situation, but it's not because of me, it's because of the norms, and the norms have been made for men in this environment. It's not the fault of anybody, it's just the norms are there. Jenny, I relate very much to what you were saying about the military, and I, you know, I put my hat to you, because this must have been even harder than for me in the humanitarian sector, to just look at these norms and think, okay, as a woman, how can I actually challenge the norm just by explaining people it's not a problem between you and me. It's not a problem of me being a woman and not having the same tone of voice, the same attitude, the same way to present, the same way to speak or to take decisions or to engage with people. But it's just that we are not recognizing that there are different norms. And one aspect on the norms that I'm constantly, you know, trying to make progress on with colleagues and with everyone I can support is the notion of norm on self-confidence. We still hear so much, you know, oh, women, they are not really self-confident. So are they really up to the job? I mean, I still hear these things like, is she ready? Does she really want it? Does she have the shoulders for it? Is she ambitious enough? Although ambition is maybe not a term that is always very nice when you connect it to a woman. It gives the impression of a woman that just has her own career path in her head and not just the good of everyone. But this notion of the norms for me on self-confidence is something extremely important, because we hear it in terms of what women will apply to if they consider that they have only 5 out of the 10 competencies requested, they will decide not to apply. And men instead, if they have 3 out of 10, they will say, okay, I'll go for it. You know, what do I risk in doing it? So just by exposing those different norms and what it requires for women to consider that there is also nothing to lose by applying and by trying is a good way to I think to break those aspects. However, really transforming norms in a sustainable way so that they are embracing the different styles and the different attitudes and the different ambitions that we have as men and women remains extremely difficult also in my humanitarian sector. I think similar to what Jenny and Amy were saying, if you don't have a leadership that is creating the space consciously and that wants it, and the leadership can do it if there is a base behind that is putting pressure, by the way. I mean, I think all the sort of groups that can put letters and requests to engage into gender diversity in an organization is very useful. But if you don't have that space left by the leadership or promoted by the leadership, it can be very, very tiring. And you might feel that you've made a success at a certain stage, but it doesn't mean that the success will stay there as things are changing in an organization. So having those networks within the professional environment to continue analyzing what are these shifting norms and are we in the right track is something that I find extremely important. Maybe just one last point on the mentoring and role models, something that I was very depressed about maybe 20 years ago now. I had read a survey within our own organization on mentors and role models, and we could see that women were actually picking best practices from a number of people. They didn't necessarily have sort of one mentor, one person that they identified with. But the other thing that we saw was that the men actually only had men as their role models. They did not consider any of the women in the leadership at the time. I mean, I hope this has changed, but at the time, they did not consider the women as their role models. So, you know, on both hands, it was very, very difficult to break this thing about who do you see as being an example for you? If men don't see women as being an example, it's not going to change the norms. And if women only have to pick and choose here and there a little bit of best practice, it is also not going to necessarily give clarity about the leadership styles that we want to have. I'll stop here. I'm sure that we'll have a lot of points that might be coming in the conversation, David.
So thank you very much, Pascale. And I'm not sure why we've lost your E. Apologies for that.